Ages. Click on is Desire of Ages by Ellen White, the middle book of the five-book series, Conflict of the Ages series. And the chapter is chapter 40. It's called A Night on the Lake, which when I typed it in seemed kind of ominous, actually. And there's three texts that I typed in as well, out of Matthew, Mark, and John. So the setting is the feeding of either the 5,000 or 7,000. Feeding of the 5,000. And that has been completed and wrapped up. And this is where the multitude gets dispersed. The disciples go on the lake. Jesus goes to pray on the mountain. And then there's the storm. And then Jesus shows up and Peter walks on the water. So I'm going to try. I put in the questions initially, but then it got lost with a little bit of chatter. So the first question I just put in here. And actually, when I read through this, I came up with 10 talking points, surprisingly enough, for such a short chapter. And then when I read through it again, it seemed like there were some high points that we should hit on. And that's what the questions are based around. And we'll kind of go through and try to have some fun with this and honestly try to learn from this. But let's bow our heads for a word of prayer, and then we'll go from there. So, dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your Sabbath. Thank you for the nice weather. We're seeing cherry blossoms finally, and it looks like spring might be on its way. Be with us as we talk about storms in our lives and expectations and disappointments that kind of come along with the storms. And fill us with your spirit, lead and guide us in this discussion for Sabbath school. And bless us this Sabbath day in your name. Amen. All right. So the first question, well, so here's the deal. We were discussing this earlier. And If I'm too loud, you can turn your volume down a bit, is what Jody's trying to tell you. Yeah. Usually we start with the question, what was your takeaway? Anyway, in an effort to not be so predictable, we aren't going to start with that question. We also aren't going to start with what you thought was the most important or least important part of this chapter. This, in my mind, there was an aha moment. And so let me give you a little bit of background. The question is, how is there an aha moment in this chapter, and how does it affect the characters in the story? And so I'm going to give a little background, and then we're going to talk about the characters, and then we have a fun little thing that we'll do that came from Jody and her job as a teacher of 7th graders. Anyway, it's interesting because this is the feeding of the 5,000. And the aha moment that I came up with is all of a sudden this multitude realizes that this guy that has gained some popularity and is attracting the multitude, which, by the way, is also around Passover time, so there's even more of a multitude than normal, all of a sudden feeds everyone, and someone in the crowd realizes that this is very similar to what happened with Moses and the Israelites in the desert when God sent them the manna. And they have a guy that's been doing miracles, healing people, for the most part, which seems like that would have been enough of an aha moment. But all of a sudden, he is feeding the people, and people are finally saying, hey, this could be the prophet that Moses talks about. And it turns out that that's in Deuteronomy 18, around verse 15 to 18, depending on what part of it you're looking at, where Moses says that there will, and actually, well, I had it, but I don't have it in front of me right now. But basically, Moses says there will be someone coming a lot like me. Keep your eyes open for him and obey him. Now it depends. Obviously, as Christians, we see that person as being Jesus. As Jews, Jews, they see it as being Joshua, who succeeded Moses to some degree, and then maybe someone later on. And then Islam sees it as the Prophet Muhammad. Just for an example of other religions looking at it. But anyway, there's this what Ellen White on page 377 describes as this miracle of feeding the 5,000 as the crowning act, and someone recognizes it and sees in that person the potential deliverer.
I don't know what that is.
You've been looking for.
That's nicely.
Yeah.
So, yes, Lee, it's very artistic.
I'm trying.
Can't see you. There you go.
Oh, wait, closer. Oh, nope.
Oh, wait, that's my phone.
Yep.
How did that work?
I think you're gonna have to reverse your camera. Just saying.
No, that shouldn't be on my phone. Anyway, you guys continue. I'll be there in a second.
We're continuing. So then,
Oh,
wow.
Did it?
that was a
A
journey.
senior moment from Lee. All right. So then what I was going to do was to say, let's look at who the characters are. And so let's just spit them out. And then we're going to do something for the discussion part of this. So who are the characters in this chapter?
Disciples.
Crowd.
Jesus.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm giving him a half there because he's one of the disciples, really. Yeah, I'm having a hard time with the half.
John wrote down Satan.
I think that one that is not mentioned by Ellen White much, but is a pivotal person in this, and that is John the Baptist, who was killed just before this, and it appears to be, from my perspective at least, one of the reasons why Christ decided to take his disciples out in kind of a secluded place to kind of recover from the blow of that. It's his cousin, a terrible way to die. His disciples went out and got the headless body and buried it. I mean, this was a major thing that happened just as this started. And well, so
that's absolutely right. I mean, that sets the scene. That's why Jesus is out in, I don't know if you call this the wilderness, but basically where he is. The disciples had just been sent 2 by 2 to kind of do mission work. Jesus had been, continuing his ministry. And in the middle of this, John the Baptist is beheaded, which is, obviously tragic for John the Baptist, but also for his disciples. And, this all kind of, talk about the perfect storm in a lot of ways. A lot of the stuff is coming together all at the same time. And that's what the last chapter was about. Jesus takes his disciples, and he takes John's disciples. They do a debriefing, and they kind of set themselves up for grieving. But the relentless multitude finds them, and Jesus has compassion on them. And then that's when he ministers to them with the disciples. They're hungry. Jesus says, says to his disciples, well, feed them. And, they're kind of throwing their hands up in the air. And then Jesus feeds them. So that's a character. I mean, a dead character. But then, so when I told Jody I wanted to kind of go through the characters, then she says, oh, that could be fun because we have this game they play in her class where when they read something, they have the characters in the reading, and then they play this game called Point of View, where each person is assigned a character, and then they discuss the story from that character's point of view. And so I kind of got excited because I figured I was going to assign Lee Satan because he's an attorney and he can have this devious side to him. But then I felt bad because I don't feel like I'd be worthy to be Jesus. And then that leaves the crowd and the disciples, plus or minus Peter. And then it just got a little complicated. So I think let's keep that in mind, and we will just discuss by keeping in mind, the different characters' point of view. So we have the characters. So the crowd, we've already mentioned the multitude. They've had this aha moment. What is their point of view?
The crowd?
Can
Oh, they go Lee.
I just want to insert really quick. So all the stuff that Ellen White's talking about was not, I only read the Matthew chapter. I didn't go to the other books, but none of that is in there. There's no talk about the crowd saying, hey, let's crown this guy. I mean, so that was all addition to the word. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, there's three different stories. And then, so the next question, since Lee's bringing it up, has to do with the story within a story. And I'll put that up, but let's keep talking.
All right.
Just in brief, so we got these, I'm going to just simplify it by saying there's four characters. There's the crowd, there's the disciples, there's Jesus, and then there's Satan working behind the scenes. So you were going to talk about the crowd or someone.
Oh, yeah, I cut you off. Sorry, Jody.
No, I'm just saying the crowd. Well, number one, they're going from, I can only imagine, you have all these people, they've been out there, they're hungry, and I don't know, just based on our own family, once people become hungry, they start to get a little hangry, and that's not a good position to be in. So we have that, but then they're fed, and they kind of rally around, and they're like, hey, is this, like, they kind of realize that Jesus might be more than just a guy up there, talking to them, and they go in that direction. But then Jesus like kind of disperses them and dispels all their hopes at that moment. So he commands the multiple to disperse them on 378, and his manner is so decisive that they dare not disobey. So he commands them to like, gotta hit enter if you want that to go. He commands them to like basically get out of there. And he commands his disciples to leave too. So they realize this, but then Jesus is like, get out. This isn't gonna happen. So I can't help but think they kind of had this wave of like, we're angry, and then like they get some food, they're a little elevated here, and then Jesus is like, no, this isn't going to happen. So leave. So
All right. So Lee, the crowd, any other input from the crowd? Lee or Dad? Dad, you look like you're ready to say something.
I am. I was just thinking that there are some attorneys in the crowd, and I'd be interested to know how Lee would look at this from attorney's point of view if he'd have been sitting in the crowd, just got through eating some well-done fish and a couple of barley loaves.
Well, I wouldn't overstate the food. It was a very humble offering.
well, food is food when you're hungry.
Right. And then just to keep things going, there is a question from the audience, the YouTube audience. Why did they stay if they were hungry? I think that's a legitimate question.
Well, I mean, maybe whatever Jesus was saying was compelling. We don't know what he was, what the sermon was about, but I've been in some sermons which I was very enthralled, and others that I just kept looking at my watch thinking, boy, I'd really rather have lunch. So, I mean, clearly this is, the Savior who is speaking. So, they were there and they were enjoying it. And then, you all of a sudden realize, man, I'm starving to death. Maybe some people started grumbling and whatever. So but to me, this is like a management of expectations. That you did not ask what was your overarching theory of this chapter, but that to me, that was it. It's not understanding the mind of God. I have to keep putting that in my own mind because the expectations here for the crowd, according to Ellen White, was completely different than what happened.
Well, yeah, and that's
Good point.
getting to the second question as well. So this is good. So I think we underestimate what it is like to be a powerful nation that is no longer a powerful nation, and in fact is a nation under the rule of another nation. And the irony that that may have if you are God's chosen people, and how much they are, they are promised someone that's going to come and save them from the situation they're in. And so they are literally always, they have these stories, they have these dreams, and they're always looking for someone. And I forget, somewhere I was reading, I mean, it was like Jesus, was the Messiah, but then there was this whole list of other Messiahs before, during, and after Jesus. And, and they were so willing to go after a Messiah to be saved from their situation that, they very much, all of a sudden, they have this person that is like the perfect Messiah. I mean, he can create food and feed the multitude. He can heal the multitude. I mean, you've got the guy that's going to be able to bring people together, actively go after the Romans, feed people while they do that, heal people as they do that. I mean, it's an unlosable situation from their point of view. And then to add to that, you have the disciples who are, so we're moving to the point of view of the disciples a little bit here. What's the point of view of the disciples?
They're joining the crowd. And their thoughts that, well, they don't think that Jesus has exalted himself enough, basically. And so they think it's their job to help bring him importance to the crowd, I guess.
Yeah, they're still working on the same temporal sort of what you're talking about. Here's this guy who's going to be our king. He's going to overthrow the Romans. They still totally missed the boat on that. I mean, why Jesus didn't sit them down at the beginning and say, okay, lads, here's how this is going to go. But he let them think, he kind of let them do this for 3 years of, kind of, yeah, we're going to have this king at the end. But anyway, so yeah, they're kind of with the crowd, but they've been with Jesus a lot longer, obviously. So they're really chomping at the bit because they know who he is. They can see, all his power, and yet they're like, come on, we got to get this party started.
But in that crowd, though, there was also, okay, when you read this particular chapter in John, the whole part of it just before this episode when he's feeding the people, is a discussion by Christ, and really a sermon by Christ, saying, I mean, in essence, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the leaders, they could see that he was feeding people, but there was this schizophrenic problem because he also had claimed to be God, or at least the Son of God, which is equal to God. And from their point of view, that was total blasphemy. And he deserved to die because of that. So there was a group of people that were trying to gather evidence so he could be killed or figure out a way that he could be done away with. And so you have this really antagonistic group of people from several different directions, and they were all there today. And the group that wanted him killed are standing around eating, and they're thinking, man, this is bizarre, what's happening here, And we are told, and just a little bit beyond the chapter that they're talking about here, and I'm not talking about a further chapter, but people became so disenfranchised with the talk that Christ gave after that about eating his flesh and all that many left him. So it was, yeah.
So that's, and we're going to talk about what Christ's point of view was. And then we'll probably move on at that point. But Lee, my question to you, because we were talking about the disciples' point of view, was why didn't you mentioned why didn't Jesus just sit down and tell them? And it seems like it's like Dad was saying, he's had opportunities to tell them, and at least in my mind, has probably told them, but for whatever reason, they are so fixed in their cultural perspectives. The expectation is that the Messiah is coming to deliver them from the Romans and to reestablish the Davidic kingdom, which was the ruling kingdom that had all this wealth and prosperity as well as peace. More maybe Solomon than David when it came to peace, but I can't help thinking that Jesus, if he did not directly tell them, had been through efforts to at least indirectly tell them. And then that discussion in John, basically, you have the Jewish leadership ready to kill him because he's saying God. I mean, that could not have been lost on the disciples. And in fact, I think that was part of what prompted them to work with the multitude and to stir up this frenzy that, yes, he's the one. We've been with him. We can attest to that, but he's just so humble, he's not going to do it on his own, which, by the way, is interesting because in a lot of ways, that was Judas's attempt to force the kingship. I think we're told a little bit later, which is interesting because this is all very much man's will versus God's will. And I think as humans, we have a hard time seeing things God's way. So then that brings us to Jesus and what's his point of view?
Well, okay, my particular take on it is that we have to remember that the John part of this chapter was written, 50 years later, after the fall of Jerusalem, after a very long time. And he, interestingly enough, starts his whole book out by saying that Christ was the creator. And then in a number of places he goes through being very specific that the God of the Old Testament is Christ of the New Testament.
Right.
And that appears to be something that is still very not very well understood even at the time of John.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. I mean, okay. No, so I mean that's
I would
almost
say
as good
that-
a transition as any to Satan's point of view.
Well, Lee has something to say.
Well, you
Okay,
jumped
go ahead.
you jumped over Jesus's point of view, and it just seems to me like there's got to be a little bit of sadness in. I'm sure he realized the crowd doesn't know what's going on, but with the disciples, I mean, which is I think the whole point of I'm going to walk out on the water and test faith and all this. But I think that there had to be some sort of sadness, overwhelmed, at least underlying this, knowing that he knows what's going to happen. So he knows the disciples are going in the wrong direction here, trying to force his hand. And I don't know if you've spent that much time with the group of people, it seems like the disappointment maybe more than sadness.
Do you think there was frustration or just sadness and disappointment?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. For me, the first thing I thought about was the sort of sad disappointment rather than frustration. But I don't know.
Because,
I think it could be frustration because these people just don't get it.
well, yeah.
There's a sentence that speaks to this. It says, with deepest solicitude, his eyes followed the storm-tossed boat with its precious burden. For these men were to be the light of the world. Those guys in that boat. And can you imagine what Christ must have thinking? You know what? They're not getting it. They're not getting it. They haven't figured this out yet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how can I say this so they'll know,
And it's really hard because I think of it, John mentioned as a lawyer. I like it when I can find it's written down. Someone tells me this is how you interpret this statute. This is what this means. Got it. That's what I'm looking for. 90% of the time, that's what I want. But then you have a child, and so with Isabella, I sometimes tell her what to do, but other times I infer and hem and haw and say, well, here's, you can do this and you can do that, because I'm wanting her to learn that lesson. So the only thing I can think of is Christ seeing these guys as his children, saying, I need you to step it up and to learn these lessons, and I want you to learn it. I don't want to just tell you, because the lawyer part of me is, I would have, like I said, I would have got these guys together and said, okay, I'm not going to be king of Israel. I mean, I would have just sat them down and told them. They clear that conversation probably didn't happen because they were looking for something different for, his whole.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's man's expectations and there's God's expectations, man's will, God's will. And I think there's a sense of, I think the quote Dad had does reflect the sadness and maybe after the frustration, but I think there's some frustration on his part because there's a situation developing that Jesus as God sees as not God's will and a problem if it were to happen. A lot of it because of the leadership and the timing of God's will being done. Because Jesus at the bottom of page 378, Jesus tells them to go and they protest. And then it says, but Jesus now spoke with an authority he had never before assumed toward them. And then the next paragraph down, it says, his manner, and this is for the crowd, not the disciples, his manner is so decisive that they dare not disobey, to the point that they basically say at some point, his words quell the tumult and frustrate their design. And even, at some point, she talks about them praising God, and all of a sudden, they are no longer praising God. But then that brings up the situation as to whether are they really praising God, or are they trying to do something against God's will that'll actually improve their own situation. But I think there is some frustration on Jesus's part with this crowd and the disciples not following God's will, but looking more towards their own will. And that leads us to the next question, because we're doing a terrible time getting through the questions in a timely fashion. The next question is how. So I see this chapter, and I agree with Lee. It's the stories in 3 books of the Bible, not 3. Yeah, the 3 Gospels.
4.
Was it in all 4? No, it's just Matthew, Mark, and John.
Okay, but it is in all 4. I'm told. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, but this usually has the children's story is highlighted in this, and that the children's story part of it is Jesus, after the crowd is dispersed and the disciples leave, goes up to pray, and I want to come back to that in a minute. But the story that we always hear about as a children's story is the storm happens, and I want to talk about that as well. Jesus shows up, and Peter walks on the water. And we all know the story. He asks Jesus if it is him, can he walk on the water? And he does walk on the water. He takes his eyes off Jesus and he starts to sink. And then Jesus grabs him by the hand, takes him to the boat, and the storm is calm. So I see this as a story within a story. That's kind of what I meant by this question. And how is the Peter part of the story similar to what we've been discussing part of the story, and how is it different? Or is it a terrible question? We can just move on.
Would you restate the question? I'm a little lost on what exactly the question is.
Okay, so this chapter 40, A Night on the Lake, we've been discussing, includes the mini story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water. So how is the big story similar to the mini story? How is the mini story different from the big story?
From Ellen White's take, it's different than I've always thought of it. You always hear the story as Peter looks at the waves and now he's scared. At least, unless I'm thinking about it wrong. But Ellen White says he looks back like, hey guys, look at me. That's a
Right.
totally different thing altogether. That's closer to what the crowd and the disciples were thinking, hey, it's time to crown this guy king.
But
Peter's kind of
Jesus is,
taking that tact. He's looking back saying, look at me, guys, and then takes his eyes off Christ. He's obviously close. If Christ can grab his hand. So
Mhm.
it was weird to me. And I also didn't think of like, if this is you, bid me come. It's like, well, who else is going to be walking on the lake that you've been living with? I mean,
well,
that's a bizarre question.
well, the
Mhm.
other bizarre part of the story, if we're going to get into the bizarre, is that she also says that Jesus walks on the water, which Jody was just like, why is he walking on the water? And my answer was like, well, he's God. He can walk on the water if he feels like it. But the bizarre part is he acts like he's walking by. Well, doesn't act. He is walking by
Yeah, he's
and
with
depends
them.
on the disciples to call him out, like basically say, hey, this is Jesus. And then he stops. And it's kind of like, if he's going out to the disciples, why doesn't he go out to the disciples? Why does he act like he's walking by? I mean, if they didn't recognize him, was he going to walk the rest of the way and just let them battle out the storm until they get to shore?
I don't know, it says then they figure out that they should cry out
Right.
seeking his help.
But John,
And then his voice silences their fear.
And they sure
But
didn't get
then
very far.
Not,
the voice
John,
silenced the fear of him being a ghost. But then it's Peter that goes and walks. But then when Peter fails and Jesus gets back in the boat, Jesus says to him, why did you doubt? Yeah, right here at the bottom of page 381. Thou of little faith, why did you doubt? Is basically what it says. Okay, Dad, go ahead.
well, what I was just addressing, well, there's two things. One is that the idea that he was going to walk by, just ignoring them, is in one chapter. But if you go to one of the other books of the Bible, it doesn't say that.
Mhm.
And I thought it's interesting that it's kind of presented by the text a couple of different ways, so that people saw it a little bit differently. The other one that I thought of as being kind of contrasting is the idea that they're seeing somebody that can feed thousands. He can walk on the water. He can silence the storm. He can heal people, and yet he can't save his own cousin from being beheaded. Now, what in the world's wrong? Why can't this guy get his act together and do what he's supposed to do?
Well, that was the other way I wanted to start this discussion. I changed my mind. And I was going to start a little gloomier with the questions, do you have storms in your life? And, the next questions coming up, talking about great spiritual darkness. Have any of us experienced great spiritual darkness? And that's in the context of we are Christians, which, the assumption as Christians is that we believe in Jesus. We believe we're saved. We trust him to know what's best for us and to lead us through life to hopefully fulfill his will more than fulfill our will. But then he also says, we are yoked. And if you follow me and do my will, your life will be a lot, I almost said easier, but maybe not easier, at least better.
I don't know if it's easier. You just have somebody help you out.
Yeah. And so how many times have we said, why? Why is my life not easier? Why does my life not feel like it's better? Why does everything I do seem to be a struggle? And Doty's comment was, you can be in one storm, but you're either, I've heard it said, you're either coming out of a storm, you're in a storm, or a storm is on the way. And that's how I was going to start it, but it just kind of seemed gloomy.
But it's kind of true, and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, you think about just this group of people right here. It's like, how many praying for Sylvia and no healing happened there. And then Jim had a major heart attack, could have easily died. Clearly, there was some, the hand of God was it. Why? Someone tell me why. I don't know.
I
don't
think you
think
have
I'll
to
ever
wait
know.
and ask Jesus that. Lee.
What?
You might have to wait till heaven to ask that question.
Well, I know,
To get
but
an
that's
answer.
that's
You
kind of
answer
my
all you
point,
want.
is we go in and out of storms, and I struggle with all the promises that I do believe in, that, we pray for things and they will happen and we ask in faith, but it doesn't, I mean, my life hasn't been like that. So that's my spiritual struggle is, but it's that back to the managing expectations. I just have to understand that what I think should happen, or what I want to happen, is not necessarily what's going to happen. So,
Okay, so I'm going to summarize this other question, and then we'll move on to the next, unless Dad has a question.
John, let me just comment though, and that is, I think you can safely say that not only is it not what you want, but it is also not what Christ wants. I mean, we get caught in a group of people that are constantly saying that God is in control of everything.
yeah.
That what is happening is God's plan. Well, was God's plan for Eve to die? Was it God's plan for Cain to be killed by his brother? Are all these God's plans? Of course not. God never planned, or did he plan a way to prevent it? Yes. But it's not his desire that all this is happening. And in many cases, he has stepped out and said, hey, this is coming. All you need to do is do this and you'll be saved. And people completely ignore it. The flood is an example. The same thing happened in Sodom itself. I mean, God was down there and said, you guys got to get out of town or the place is going to burn. Not me. And he actually had to drag most of the people out of town.
So that's too good of a transition to the next question, which I like to think of as a bombshell, because I think it's a legitimate question. Does God send storms our way when we hit self-inflicted, I might add, great spiritual darkness? Because I think that's what Ellen White gets to on page 380. And again, you've heard me talk about unbelief versus doubt. And I think there's a subtle difference. And Jesus accuses Peter of doubting. But Ellen White gets into the unbelief on page 380, how the disciples knew Jesus, they loved him, but they had all of these questions. And then it kind of leads to more questions and more unbelief until in reading between the lines, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, she feels like the disciples should have been celebrating what happened and not bemoaning what didn't happen. And that got worse and worse and worse. And then at the bottom of the page, their thoughts were stormy and unreasonable, and the Lord gave them something else to afflict their souls and occupy their minds, i.e. the storm. And then the next question is, not question, this was my question, is God often does this when men create burdens and troubles for themselves. So are the storms in our lives our fault and just a natural consequence of the bad decisions we make in a world of sin? Or is God hitting us with bad weather to turn us around and get us towards him?
I have a little hard problem with the way you worded that. Does God send storms our way? Do you think God sends storms our way to
I'm
keep
just saying what Ellen White said.
I know, but are you saying God just keeps testing us? And I mean, that's what she says. Because where's that part?
This is the part I was just reading right here.
Yeah, but he says, he's giving them this diversion to sort out and how they're going to trust him. I don't know. I guess I have a hard time thinking God just is keeping storms on our life, because I don't think that's, he wants us to trust
Satan
him
altogether, right? I mean, we are here on this place where Satan's running around. I think we learn from our relationship with God to allow the bad things that do happen. I don't think well, I don't know. I don't think God's intending bad things to happen to us and like sending bad things to us, but they do happen. Satan's here making bad things happen. So, but our relationship should refocus on Christ to help us get through that storm. And that way we do have a teaching moment during these bad times. Before we move on, John, you were reading their unbelief. And another thing that Ellen White pointed out that I highlighted was it wasn't, it was a focus on self, because one of the things is that were we always to be accounted followers of a false prophet? And that kind of resonated. It wasn't so much like things weren't happening, but it was like, now I look bad. I look bad because I'm following this guy who's not doing what we want him to do, and that reflects on me. And I thought that, again, that's the whole self-focus more than Christ focus. Sorry to disrupt.
I had a birthday this last week, and Mark asked Zayden. Zayden is 4 years old. He's my grandson, and we spend a fair amount of time together, off and on. And she asked Zayden. He asked Zayden, "How old do you think Grandpa is?" And Zayden thought about it for a little while, and he says, "Boy, I think he's probably 8 years old, maybe 11." And then he asked me, how old I was. And, there's no way in the world that he can fathom 82 years. I mean, that's just beyond the scope of anything he can relate to. 82 years is what, 20 lifetimes for him or whatever. And I think that that's what God is dealing with, is that in so many ways, God is so far beyond anything that we can comprehend, that trying to sort out all these things, saying, okay, now whose fault was this and all that. I think that's I think that yes, some of it's our fault. Some of it may be Satan's fault. Some of it may be the fault of the way things were put together. And there's a line in the Bible that says time and chance occurs. Now, I can only remember that. I don't remember exactly where, because one of my theological cousins was kind of put off by that particular quote. And so I think that there are a group of things. And so my only response to the overall thing is that I believe that God is a God of love 100% of the time. I think he is always a God of love. That when he is painted in any other way, that's wrong. That he is, in fact, a God of love that cares about us 100% of the time.
Yeah, so I'm just going to tag along there, because that's the resolution to this question that I came up with. Not that that's the answer to the question by any means, and that's why we're having a discussion about it. But we've talked about two things that go along with this question. We've talked about the disciples and how they got into their heads, so to speak. And I think as humans and sinful humans, we tend to do that, and some of us more than others. We tend to overthink things. We tend to question things. We start to have doubt, and then we start to have unbelief, kind of in that order. And then my wife will point out when I start catastrophizing things, because sometimes it can lead to catastrophizing things. And as Christians, we shouldn't be doing that. And I don't know where you draw the line as Christians. I mean, I guess ideally you recognize what my dad was saying, and that is that there's a lot more going on, not even in the world, but in the universe, than what we realize. And we tend to see this bubble around ourselves, and we've all had problems at one point in time. And I remember when I was going to bring up specific problems, but it just, this isn't going to turn into a therapy session. But when someone has a specific problem, they tend to talk about it, or they don't. But the people that tend to talk about it, that's also what they only talk about. And after a while, you're just kind of like, okay, but that's kind of the way it is for all of us. We tend to go from one problem to the other, and that's kind of what we were talking about. But I think it is very informative. Page 379. It's basically one whole paragraph. And it talks about what Jesus did. He dispersed, he sent the disciples to the boat to start heading to the next destination. He dispersed the crowd. He used authority to do this. And then he went to the mountain to pray. And they talk about Jesus praying through the night, praying in the wee hours of the morning. And this brought up the question, what does Jesus pray about? And again, a lot of it is commentary, but this is informative because, and she put quotation marks around it, so I don't know if it came from somewhere or not, but she talks about Jesus when he went up to the mountain to pray. I guess that's the part that's the quotation. And then she adds to it. She says he's not praying for himself, but he's praying for his disciples because he knows that they're disappointed, and he's praying that God fills them with the Spirit to be strong and courageous with, the kingdom of heaven being on earth being completely different than what they think it is, and to give them courage to face that, courage to minister to others with that in mind, and ultimately courage to accept his crucifixion. So, in a lot of ways, it was an attempt at coronation that Jesus prevented from happening, with the real coronation being his crucifixion, which is the farthest thing from, the multitude's mind, let alone the disciples' mind. And the disciples are in the inner circle, at least to some degree. And I think that comes back to the question that we had is, where is God? Where is Jesus right now? And as Adventists, I think there aren't a lot of unique things to Adventism, but one of them has to do with the atonement and Jesus ministering to us between the great disappointment of 1844 and now. And yeah, he could do that with a snap of a finger. I get it. And I'm sure there's other things that are going on. But you read in Hebrews and with our tradition as Adventists, Jesus is still looking out for us. He is still ministering for us. He is providing that Spirit to keep us strong and courageous in the faith that we have and to continue and to grow that faith. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is Jesus goes from the mountain back down to the disciples, and he is there in the flesh to help save them from themselves and the storm, whether the storm was brought on by God or the storm just came along.
John, let me just, that first point you made, I think is really an incredibly important point. And the Bible talks about prayer in a couple of different ways. But we are told, he said, okay, how should we pray? And then they give us the Lord's Prayer. That's completely different kind of prayer than what he prayed when he said, let this thing go away. I don't want to be crucified. Those are two completely different kinds of prayers. And I will tell you, I really resonate with that last prayer. That prayer is, what in the world am I supposed to do now? Kind of a prayer, And I suspect that that's the kind of prayers that Christ did, We know that he cried sometimes, he wept, he was in terrible shape during these times of prayer. But okay, and then let me just speak to the last question that you posed, and that is, I was reading this morning in 2 Corinthians, and it says that the Lord, and this is Christ in this sentence, is the Spirit that ministers to us. So it looks like to me that the Lord is ministering to us on a daily basis, each one of us, all the time.
And I think our human nature is not to look for that and to see it. I think we have to conscientiously do that and I think that's what we see with Jesus. Jesus is there. It's up to us to see him walking by. And he doesn't force himself on us. He gives us the freedom to either take it or leave it. And obviously in the middle of the storm, you're going to take it. Hopefully. And that brought up, when do you... Yeah, well, maybe, for sure. But for some reason, the road to Emmaus, Jesus showing up, after his death to these two unknown disciples, basically, and ministering to them while they're walking and them not even knowing, was another, kind of take it or leave it. And they finally recognize it and they take it, and they take it all the way back, backtrack the whole way they came to Jerusalem. And all of a sudden, Jesus is, he's not even trying to hide the divine. He's walking through buildings and just showing up here and there. But I think it's like you say, he's there, and he's there every day, every moment of every day. And it's up to us to kind of reach out and take his hand and let him take us through, some of these problems that we create for ourselves, some of these problems that just happen, and maybe some of these problems that Jesus gives us to test us. And that's my last question. So I'm going to throw that up because we're less than 10 minutes left. So the last question is, what are our thoughts on God's daily tests? Because I think that's what you were referring to. Well, not exactly what you're referring to, but Ellen White speaks of daily tests that lead to preparation for bigger tests down the road. And then Jody's question is, does it ultimately lead to, the big one? And if so, what is the big one?
Well, I said, I don't think that we know what the big test is for us. I mean, I think we're constantly have small tests that we work through every day. And that's like, I don't think there's like, is there the pinnacle of tests? I don't know. I don't think so.
I would, in terms of with the story, either these, I don't know that much about sailing, but either these guys were really bad sailors, but I mean, so Christ leaves this crowd probably in the light because there's no electricity, goes up and prays, and it's something like 3 a.m. or whatever. These guys didn't sail very far. If Christ can just walk out to them, they've got to be tired, right? So I'm thinking, to me, that's the daily test. I mean, these guys are working hard, and then so by the time Christ is there, in my opinion, they got to be exhausted because they're battling or they're going backwards, but they didn't get very far that Christ could easily walk out to them. So to me, that's kind of like the daily test, like how we react going through test after test. Like, it brings us to this exhaustion. Can we then go beyond that to stay focused on Christ? And maybe I'm reading too much into the story. I don't know.
Well, and the irony, there's a lot of irony, obviously, but the irony is that they are, like we originally talked about, trying to go to a place where they can debrief and kind of grieve. And boom, they're hit with this test to the point of, potentially dying in a storm in the middle of it all.
Well, we know from the book of Job that Satan can make a storm just like that too. And he can destroy people like that. And it's so that, who caused the storm? I don't know. I don't have a good sense on that. But I do agree with Jody very much that it is, that I think that the test, and I think we can even find scriptural support for that it's these everyday little, decisions that we make are the thing that ultimately makes the final thing, the final decision about what happens. And I feel like that basically Christ treats us very much like he does. He says, I stand here, I'm knocking, I'm willing to come in, just open the door, or leave the door open, whatever you want to do. I'm here. I'm a resource for you. It's free, and I'm willing to help you anytime you want. And so it seems like that's the way I view it anyway, is that it's not these giant tests. I mean, when I think back, what giant tests have I had that really made a huge decision for me? Well, I guess, to go into mission service was one of those, but really that was something I decided, off and on for years before that,
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting how what you think you're in the middle of when it comes to a giant test, in retrospect, it wasn't a daily test, but it was just a test. And, so when you were talking, I was thinking, well, do you die from 1,000 little cuts or you die from one big cut? But then I immediately went to, I don't think dying and not dying is the test. It's how you live your life. And if you live your life with Christ, then, whether it's a big test or a little test, you're living it the right way. And ultimately, that leads to a life eternal that you can live with Jesus. And maybe that's ultimately the test or the
John,
outcome of the test that we should be living.
John, if you don't mind me using you as an illustration, but I can remember that when you went to New York to start that surgery residency, that you were one terrified guy. You had just met a couple of the people. One of them had a PhD. Another one was already a specialist in surgery, and everybody around you was smarter than you. And they were very candid about letting you know that. And I can remember that you were terrified. I mean, you were getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and you're going to bed at midnight. And you knew that you had a test, and during that test, it was going to be coming up that you were going to be washed out unless you got started studying. So you didn't wait, though, until the night before the test to start studying. You started studying right at the very beginning. And it wasn't, and you kept on studying at a frantic pace the whole way. I remember that the resident, the guy that was in charge of residents said, John never even spoke once the whole first year that he was here. That's because you were thinking and reading and studying, Now you were surrounded by plenty of people that did all the talking that needed to be done. But in any event, I think that's more the way life is in general. It's the, did you have to take the test? Absolutely, you took the test. But it wasn't what you did the last 2 weeks or the last 2 months. It was what had happened the whole year before that.
Yeah, and to wrap up the story, I did a lot better than I ever thought I would do on the test, and apparently a lot better than the program ever thought, because it kind of secured my position. But I think the other point to that, I hate using myself as an analogy, is once I took the test, once I passed the test, I didn't stop studying because every year there was another test and you're expected to know more every year because you'd had more training every year. And so, yeah, I think maybe that is a lot of what it's like. It's that day in and day out. You aren't just saved and one and done kind of saved. And I think there are a group of people that do believe that. I think, and that's disappointing because I think there is value in knowing God, learning about Jesus, learning about what he did here on earth, and using that as an example to apply to your life and continuing that in life to come. And I think we're just about out of time. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Can you say prayer to wrap things up?
Sure. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today and for this lesson. And there's a lot of different angles and different stories within it. And we pray for your leading in our lives and the things that you have to teach us. And may we be faithful daily, because sometimes we know we can get off, but help us to refocus again and be with us this Sabbath. Thank you for your Sabbath, the day of rest, that we can focus on you and to take a break from our daily duties and be with us and guide us in our life choices. In Jesus' name, amen.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to thank my panelists for being here. What did you say, Lee?
I came late, so maybe I missed the discussion, but what happened to your face? Your beard?
Oh,
Oh, My dad was saying I looked like his dad.
My grandfather,
Did you
actually.
just try to shave in various spots just to see what would happen, or?
No, so I
Well,
was saying I went from a number 2, which seemed appropriate for a proctologist, to a number 3. So, sorry if that's getting recorded, but yeah, that was the discussion, and then we couldn't see you and your bearded face. But anyway, so there is a church service to follow. And so please feel free to either come in person or join us online with the church service as well. And we appreciate the questions from outside. I always like getting questions from outside because it tells us, first of all, that people are listening, and second of
Otherwise,
all,
you feel like you're talking to no one.
I think it's important to know that we don't have all the answers, but we do enjoy the discussion. And I think the discussion, when spirit led, does lead to some answers, for sure. So anyway, thanks everyone. Have a good Sabbath. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Dad. And thanks, Sam, for letting us do this. That's
Thank
Pastor.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye.